Hello, it's Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity project. I'm doing a video for the Together Strong project, which is a project based on bringing people together for common cause. More specifically, this channel is focused on bringing libertarian thinkers together to discuss and debate various elements in the hope of getting closer to truth. We've already had a couple of very interesting debates on this channel, but today we're going to have a discussion on intellectual property, which is an area of libertarianism that perhaps gets a bit neglected, not always mentioned, and often misunderstood by many people. So I've got two people here with me to have this conversation. One is Econ Bro, who's a libertarian who's doing some tremendous work in Nigeria, educating people about property rights, libertarian principles, as well as things like inflation. And the other person I have here to have this conversation is probably the best person to speak to about intellectual property is Stephan Kinsella, who, in addition to being a very well-respected libertarian author, is an anti-IP patent lawyer, or a patent attorney, sorry, as he's been well known as. And so he knows obviously a lot about intellectual property as it exists in current law, and also how it should exist or not exist, as the case may be. Before we kick off, I just want to say thank you and introduce Econ Bro first, and just say thank you, Econ, for taking the time to have this conversation. If you just want to briefly introduce yourself to people listening.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Stephan. As you said, I'm Econ Bro. That's not my real name. It's just the name I use for my work. So this is my third time on the show. This is the first show. I don't think I've ever been on any show. Okay, just one other show I've done twice, and then this is my third time on your show. So this has to be this is a record for me, and it's great to be back here. I'm not too comfortable with you calling me a libertarian thinker because I don't particularly consider myself one. I'm relatively new to this. As you know, as I said in our first meeting, I got introduced to libertarianism in 2021. So I'm relatively new to this, as I'm sure you know. So please don't call me a libertarian thinker. I don't want Mr. Kinsella to have his hopes up, and then I would have to dash those hopes. So what I do here, since I came to learn of libertarianism, I consider myself a Rothbardian and anarcho-capitalist. Since I started to learn about libertarian anarchist values, I decided to teach these things to young people to people in my country, regardless of age. So my strategy is to go from university campus to university campus across the country, talking to economic students of philosophy and politics about the ideas that I've come to learn from Rothbard, Mrs. Hopper, and pretty much David Friedman, and pretty much everyone I've come across in my study. So that's basically who I am and what I do. I don't have much to offer to this conversation, but I guess I'm willing to learn. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry, I am going to have to call you a libertarian thinker. I didn't say you're a libertarian know-it-all, but you're definitely a libertarian thinker because none of us know it all, but we're all making the journey and refining our understanding as we go. And a reason why I thought this would be a great conversation for you to be involved in is because intellectual property is perhaps something that you could kind of add to your repertoire of things to talk about when you're educating people in Nigeria about various elements about property rights and libertarianism. And as I say, I don't think there's a better person to speak to about this subject than Stephan. So in addition to wanting to introduce you and Stephan to each other, as I said before, you're both two of my favorite libertarian thinkers. You both approach the topic of liberty with courage and humility, and deep thought, and that's why I respect both of you very highly. So I'm very pleased to introduce you to each other, and I think it's going to be a very productive conversation because, as I say, intellectual property is something that I think a lot of people get wrong, or a lot of people just forget about altogether when we're having the libertarian conversation and talking about these issues. Stephan Kinsella, who's very well known for doing a lot of great contributions to libertarianism, but he is in particular very well known for his work on intellectual property. He knows a lot about the law as it is, as he was a patent attorney, and he obviously knows a lot about how intellectual property should operate in a libertarian society. So without further ado, I just want to pass over to Stephan now to say thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. And if you could just introduce yourself as well.
Sure, happy to do it. Yeah, I'm Stephan. I'm kind of a retired patent attorney here in Houston, Texas. I'm from Louisiana originally, which is a civil law state, which most people don't find interesting, but I do. I have been interested in libertarian theory for quite a long time. It's probably since high school. And then in law school, I started studying more on the theoretical side and sort of writing. So I've written about a lot of topics about the foundations of libertarianism, contract theory, rights theory, punishment theory, causation. But intellectual property was one of the things I started writing about, and I did it out of necessity because I was becoming more radical. Like I was originally a Randian, like an objectivist, right? So I believed in the minimal state and believed strongly in individual rights. But then finally, I became aware of the arguments of the anarcho-capitalists, and Econ. I thought you were going to say I'm not a libertarian yet. I'm a classical liberal. I'm not sure, and then you say I'm not a libertarian, but I'm an anarcho-capitalist. So I'm a little bit confused. You said you actually are. You're an adherent of the views of David Friedman and Murray Rothbard and this kind of stuff, right? Did I understand?
Yes. Oh yeah, well, I said I'm not. I don't. I said I don't consider myself a libertarian thinker.
Oh,
right? That
I
was
see.
what Matthew called me.
I see.
Yes, I'm libertarian. I'm an anarchist. Yes.
I see. Okay, because I know one of my friends, Michael Malice, always, if you call him a libertarian, he says I'm not a libertarian. I'm an anarchist, and I always find that an odd thing. It's
strange.
A stubborn thing.
Yeah.
In my view, libertarianism is a broader category that encompasses minarchists and anarchists. And now I do think that only the anarchists are they're the only consistent libertarians. But nonetheless, I think the term is broad enough to include minarchists too, even though they're inconsistent libertarians. But anyway, I was just curious about that point. But so I myself moved from sort of Randian minarchism, I used to call it the night watchman state, that kind of idea. When I finally, it was sort of like becoming an atheist for me. Like when I was young, I finally gave up the idea of God, because once you start challenging one part of the Catholic faith, for example, which I was raised in, it all falls apart, because, you know, if you're extremely into consistency and you're into rationalism and reason, you know, that's the hallmark of a questioner. And that's what happened with me. I mean, Rand, to me, I became a libertarian out of nothing. I was never a conservative. I was never a lefty like a lot of libertarians. I was just nobody. I was just a kid who didn't know anything about economics or anything. But when I read Rand in high school, this sort of focus on the individual and his rights, and this kind of her logic of rights in her other writing appealed to me. It just makes sense, right? The only laws that are justified are laws that are aimed at preventing the use of force, because force is ultimately the only way to violate rights, and that's because property rights just are the right to control a scarce resource, including your body, and then other things that we own. So to me, it all made sense. But then, of course, if you say the government's justified, well, then you have the question, well, then why don't we have a one world government? Why wouldn't that make sense? And the Randians really have no good answer to that. In fact, some of them, if you push them, they will say, yeah, theoretically, we should have a one world government with one uniform system of laws, which shows that they're more interested in uniformity and a final result rather than justice. But they will admit that in today's world, it would be foolish to have a one world government, because most of the country's not Western enough or something like that. So, and it's just a mishmash of ideas. In any case, I was but because the Randians initially, and by the way, this is not intellectual property, this is a prelude, but the Randians had harsh criticisms of libertarians. And because I was new to all this, I at first thought Ayn Rand was correct, and her disciples like Peter Schwartz and Leonard Peikoff, they just bashed libertarianism as sort of this like infiltrator that was a dishonest imitator of her political philosophy. And so in my first couple years, I thought libertarianism was like the devil, because I thought that they were just an imposter. But I kept running into the pamphlets of the Libertarian Party on campus at my college, and they all seemed identical to what I was believing. So I went to this was 1988 when I was in law school by this point. And I went to or almost almost in law school, and I went to hear Ron Paul, who was the Libertarian Party candidate. He came to campus. I went to hear him speak because I was curious. Like they seem libertarian, and the problem is at that point I was a diehard objectivist, and my main focus was on abortion rights and pro-choice. And so Ron Paul was the one candidate the Libertarian Party has nominated that is actually sort of not really he's pro-life, right? He's not pro-choice. And so I went to the classroom, and I just wanted to find out what the libertarian position on abortion was. I assumed he was a spokesman for libertarianism, which he wasn't, right? So I remember I raised my hand and I asked him a question about, wait, are you guys pro-choice or not? Because I was getting mixed messages, and he hemmed and hawed, and he kind of refused to answer the question, which confirmed for me Rand's suspicion that the libertarians are not really objectivists, although most libertarians actually were pro-choice. I just didn't know it at the time. Anyway, long story short, pretty soon after that, I read David Friedman, I read the Tannehills, I read Rothbard, and I finally realized the anarchists are correct, and the government cannot be justified. Taxation cannot be justified, which even Ayn Rand kind of admitted taxation can't be justified. So that's sort of my backstory. But when I started practicing law and I started writing, so as a lawyer, I wanted to have a career, make money, be successful. And part of that is writing. That's one way some lawyers do it. One way they develop business is to get their name out there. And one way you do it is by, family connections or networking from your school or from your community or from your family. And another way some people do it is by writing and speaking, because that's another way to do it. And I didn't have any of the family connections, and I came from nothing. So I thought I can make myself known by publishing in journals and newspapers and things like that as a lawyer. And that's a way to get your name out there to land clients. So I had that side of my profession and my life. And I did it because I was good at it and I enjoyed writing. There's a scholarly aspect to me. So I tried to be a blend of practical, and you can build that into a practice, right? At the same time, as a hobby, the way I look at it is vocation versus avocation, the way Gary North explains it in some of his articles. If you're lucky, you can blend your vocation with your avocation. Most people are not that lucky. Maybe some professors are like that, but most people, if you're a plant worker or you're a factory worker at Amazon and you're stocking shelves, that might not be your passion in life. Your passion might be bowling, right? Or it might be, I don't know, volunteering at something. So what you do is you have part of your life is having a career, paying the bills, and then you use the money you earn to support your hobbies and your interest and your passions. Nothing wrong with that. I think that's perfectly natural, and that's what I sort of ended up doing. I ended up using my career as an attorney and my salary to subsidize my passions on the other side. And I never looked at the other stuff as money making. I didn't want to be a professor. I didn't want to work for a think tank. I didn't want to be beholden to some personality like Cato or even Mises Institute. I wanted to be totally independent, make money, and I could probably make more money as an attorney, and then just use that to be independent and do my own thing, which is what I've done. And it's worked out pretty well because I kept having the freedom to write not only my legal stuff for my career, but also all the libertarian and libertarian theory, which I enjoyed. Now, one of my first articles was on rights theory. By the way, Matthew, I thought you and I had already talked about IP, so I was wondering why we were doing this again. But I looked. We've talked about voluntary slavery, I think contract theory, and maybe immigration. but yeah, you and I never did talk about IP, so this is opportune. And so I started practicing law in 1992 in Houston as an oil and gas attorney, which I really liked because it deals with property law, contracts, business deals, things like that. But I soon moved from oil and gas law into patent law and intellectual property law because for personal reasons, I wanted to move to another state. So it worked out. And plus, the demand was obvious. That this was the early 1990s, and intellectual property law and tech law was becoming really hot. The internet was becoming hot, so everyone kept saying, "Hey, Kinsella, you're an electrical engineer by your background, because in America, if you're an attorney, you have to have an undergraduate degree first, and usually it's a history degree or an economics degree or something like that. But on occasion, you'll have someone who's an engineer who goes to law school, which was me. And if you're an engineer, then you have the credentials you need to become a patent attorney, because you have to have a technical degree plus law school to be a patent attorney. So I was in demand in a field where there's a narrow supply, and the field was improving. And everyone kept saying, "Why aren't you a patent attorney?" And I was like, I didn't even take a course on this in law school. It didn't even occur to me. But it turned out that was the obvious thing for me to shift into. So I shifted to IP law to catch the wave of tech law and technology becoming more a thing in the world, and the internet itself, right? And digital, streaming and file sharing and all this kind of stuff. And so, and I was good at it because I can. You have to know like the intersection of 2 or 3 or 4 things to be a good patent attorney. You have to know how to speak to engineers, which means you need to know technology and how to speak. And you also need to know the law, and you need to know the administrative practice and the business part. I mean, like, it's a weird combination of skills, which not everyone has. A lot of engineers could not be good patent lawyers because they're not good at communication. A lot of lawyers couldn't be good patent lawyers because they don't understand technology. So if you happen to have a combination of talents, anyway, it worked out. But because I was a libertarian and was writing on rights theory and other things, Ayn Rand's argument for intellectual property, which I read in high school or in college, always bothered me because it's an incomplete, or it seems to be a bad argument. Like, your argument for rights made sense to me. Rights are reciprocal. You can only use force in response to force. You can only use physical force to retaliate against someone who used force against you. I mean, that's what John Galt says. Do you hear me? You may not start the use of force, right? That had an intuitive appeal to me. And then if you know a little bit about economics from Henry Hazlitt or Mises or these guys, you start understanding why free enterprise and the free market, they all kind of go together, and they support this idea that we have to have property rights not only in our bodies, which is implied by the Randian non-aggression axiom or the libertarian non-aggression principle. Basically, those are different ways of saying there's a property right in your body, self-ownership, right? That's ultimately the basis of the political ethics of objectivism and, I think, of libertarianism. But then that also applies to the ownership of external resources in the world, which is why we have the homesteading principle and contract theory, which explains who can come to acquire ownership in these things, not only in our body, but outside of ourselves. Like, how do we come to own this piece of land or this piece of wood or this fruit or this tree or this cow? It's because of acquisition of property rights from acts of homesteading or from voluntary transfers from someone else, which is trade and commerce and the free market. So to me, those are the corners of libertarianism. But I noticed that the argument for intellectual property made no sense, because for one thing, the first thing that occurred to me was, well, if you think, most people don't realize this because they're not sophisticated attorneys understanding international law and domestic legal systems, but we live in a world where everything that's owned under a property system is usually governed by the jurisdiction of the local legal system, usually the local government, right? Like in America, it'd be the federal government or the states. So if I own a home in Texas, I own that home by virtue of the Texas law, the real estate law that protects the right to own a home. But that right is what we call in law an in rem right, not an in personam right. In rem means it's a right to a thing, and when you say it's in rem, it means it's good against the world. It means it means you don't own it because of a contract with someone. You own it because you're the owner, right? So if I own this house, sure, it's protected by Texas state law, but that law is all I need to say that I'm the owner, and it prevents me from being robbed, or it prevents my house from being used or taken from me by someone on the outside, whether they're from Nigeria or China or Louisiana or Texas. It doesn't matter. Like, so in a sense, all property rights are always in rem. They're good against the whole world. They're good against the whole world, even though there's one legal system that defines that, but they're good against the world, right? Intellectual property, by contrast, so there's two things that strike you if you understand this about intellectual property. Number one is that they expire at a certain arbitrary time. So copyright used to last 14 or 28 years, and now copyright lasts for the life of the author plus 50 years or plus 70 years, depending upon the country. So they expire at time, and patents last for about 17 years. So these are rights that expire. Well, my right to my watch or my car or my cow or my turtle or my land, it doesn't expire at 17 years or 50 years. It theoretically could last forever. So the first thing you notice is, well, why would these rights expire at a certain time? And how do we know that's the right time? Like, how do we get this? So that's the first thing that makes you think, there's something wrong with the argument for IP. And the other one is this idea that rights by their nature are always good against everyone, unless it's a contract, but that's in personam. So if Matthew and I have a contract, we sort of set the law between each other about how we're going to treat a certain object or a certain stream of money or something. So that doesn't affect the rest of the world. So that's in personam. That's what contracts are for. But property rights are good against the world. They're in rem. Okay. So, like I said, once I have a property right in my house or my land, that property right, to the extent that it's enforceable by whatever legal system, it would prevent a German guy from, or a Chinese government. I mean, no one can do it. I mean, no one can use it without my permission. But intellectual property is always domestic. It's not international. There are international treaties that everyone agrees to have similar standards, but it's always a local thing. So, for example, when people accuse China of, they call it stealing intellectual property. And what they mean by that is that, well, first of all, they don't know what they mean by that, but because it's never clear whether they're talking about the Chinese government or Chinese companies. And also they mix up trademark, trade secret, patents, and copyrights. They mix them all together, and they mix in the word plagiarism and the word fraud and the word stealing and the word ripping off and the words piracy. They just jumble them all together, and they're all different concepts. But what they really mean is that, here's what they really mean, by the way. If you open a factory in China, if Apple in America opens a factory in China to have iPhones assembled, why do they do that? Because the cost of labor is cheaper, right? They could do it in California, but it's too expensive. So they open a factory in China. But when you open a factory in China, you're operating within the jurisdiction of the Chinese government, and you have to get permissions because it's not a free market. So you have to get all these licenses and all these local things. And because they're not quite a free market, what they often do is they'll say, well, we're going to let you open a factory here, but you have to partner with a local firm. You have to do a joint venture and employ a certain number of people. So the politician can get credit for jobs, right? So Apple faces the cost, the choice, well, is it worth it to us? We can't have our own factory in China that we totally control. We have to partner with a local company to please the local politicians. And that's going to reduce our efficiency a little bit. And it also reduces our control because now you don't know what these Chinese employees are going to do. So, hey, maybe one of them might sneak a picture of the latest iPhone design and leak it to one of his buddies who's down the road at another factory, and they start making iPhone knockoffs, right? By the way, this happens in America. This happens everywhere. There's always the danger of employees leaking trade secrets. But anyway, what they're talking about is when people say China is stealing our IP, they're talking about the Chinese government regulations requiring companies, as a price of doing business there, to partner with local Chinese firms, and then it's hard to keep track of trade secrets being leaked. By the way, trade secrets are one type of intellectual property, but it's not patent and copyright. So, and by the way, even if you didn't have to work with a Chinese firm, you still have to hire local Chinese employees. Even if you totally control the factory, you could still have trade secret theft. This happens all the time. It's called economic espionage. It happens in America. American companies, everyone does this. This has got nothing to do with anyway. So, but when people criticize China, they say China's an IP thief. And what they also mean is that up until recently, China and the developing world and a lot of Asian countries had a reputation that they don't respect intellectual property, which means that it's easy to find knockoffs of CDs and movies. But all that means is that they're just poorer countries where people engage in rampant piracy. They don't respect the law. That means the local police and the legal system is not completely efficient at stopping piracy. Guess what? It's also not completely efficient at stopping piracy in Britain or in the US. I mean, yeah, we send some people to prison to send an example to make, to make an example out of them when we catch a guy that uploads the Wolverine movie, for example. I think we just lost Econ.
Yeah, he's got dodgy internet, so you might cut in and out a bit. But
do you want to wait, or do you want to?
I'll keep going. I would, and yeah, he's back. He normally comes straight back. So,
and I'll stop in my ramble in just a second. But I'm just getting to the point of, like, I guess I was getting to the point of the one thing that made me uneasy about patents and copyright is that they're domestic, which means that, so let's say China did not have a copyright law, in which they're under no obligation to have a copyright law. That's their local law. That would be like saying China violates the rights of Americans because China has taxes that are too high, or China doesn't permit you to build a bridge in your town because I mean, it's like really none of our business what the local property law in China is. And so if China had no patent law and no copyright law, they would not be violating the rights of Americans. And the reason is because patent and copyright law are domestic. And what that means is, if I'm the author of a book in the US or in Britain, I have a copyright enforced only in those countries because they have copyright law. But if someone makes a knockoff of my book in Nigeria, and Nigeria doesn't have a copyright law, the company is literally not violating the rights of American companies because they don't have a copyright in that country, right? So when people say China's stealing something by basically allowing piracy and patent infringement, et cetera, to go on in China without having draconian enforcement of those laws, which is as bad as the US enforcement, it's not stealing. It's, first of all, it's infringement, not stealing, but it's not even infringement because it's not illegal in China. If they don't have a patent law, it's not illegal for someone to copy what you're doing. This is why you might move your manufacturing to a country that doesn't have a strong IP base, which is why there are no strong countries that don't have IP, because the Western countries like America and Europe use their power to bully other countries to accept, to join these treaties like the Madrid Trademark Treaty, the patent treaties, the copyright treaties, and to keep enforcing their laws. It's sort of like when the US bullies NATO countries to increase their defense spending so they can be part of NATO. We bully these countries to do this stuff. Anyway, that's a long rant. So to get to the actual thing, though, so I started looking at IP because I thought every argument I've heard for IP is bad because the term limits are arbitrary. The argument seemed like to be a mixture of utilitarian and Lockean. So I thought, well, I'm actually a new budding libertarian thinker. I know a lot about objectivism. I know a lot about rights. I know a lot about law. I know a lot about legal theory. I know a lot about economics. I'm going to figure this out. So I embarked on the project to figure out the best argument for intellectual property because no one else had succeeded. And I kept hitting roadblocks. I would try this argument, and then I would say, no, there's a problem there, over and over again. And finally, I did what I did with God. Well, hey, maybe the reason why there's a contradiction in the Catholic faith about this idea of eternal punishment for hell, which makes no sense to me. Like, how can you be punished eternally, an infinite amount of punishment for a finite amount of evil you could do in the world? That was what made me start thinking, oh, the reason is you can't justify it, which means that the story about hell must be wrong, which means the Catholic Church must be wrong, which means probably all the religions are wrong. You know, that was so that happened, and that's why I became an anarchist. I'm like, yeah, you can't justify the state. And so for IP, I thought, well, let me reverse my assumption. Maybe I've been trying too hard to prove something that's just unprovable, or as Walter Block might say, I was defending the undefendable, or I was trying to justify the unjustifiable. And that is my conclusion. I ended up with that conclusion after exploring every possible avenue, and it was creeping up on me. I started realizing the importance of scarcity. Scarcity as an economic concept and as a political concept, as a human concept of understanding human action in the world, right? And by the way, this goes along with my understanding of Austrian economics, which was informed heavily by Mises and his praxeology. And I do think that once you have a good grasp on the economic foundations that Mises focused on in praxeology, and then just basic free market economic principles like supply and demand, that kind of stuff, and then also a little bit of knowledge about history and political philosophy, political theory, and then rights and consistency and principle, it's pretty easy to see what the fundamental flaw is in every intellectual property system. And primarily I'm talking about patent and copyright and all the arguments in favor of it. And so I started to unpack all this. And in doing that, it really strengthened, in my view, it strengthened my understanding of libertarian, because to sort out this kind of IP puzzle, you have to really have a good understanding of the nature of rights and how we justify rights and how they interplay with each other. And we can go into the detail of this in a minute if you want, but to me, that was the structure of what happened to me. And this is why I'm so passionate about it. It's like, it's really an easy argument to make once you kind of see how to make it in a coherent, clear way. Once you see it, it's hard to unsee, I believe. Which is why, like, so you could identify as libertarian, probably 7 or 8 things that we all say the state does, which are horrible intrusions into life, abominations, they destroy lives. We probably, almost all of us agree on most of these things. War, the central banking system, inflation, right? Taxation, redistribution by welfare, government control of schools and transportation. All these things are horrible. And, some people focus on one more than the other. Some people focus on war as the main thing. Some people focus on taxes as the main thing. Some focus on spending by the state as the worst, and redistribution and the problems wrought by the welfare state. Oh, the drug war is another one. The drug war. I mean, you could point to problems with every one of those. But the thing about almost every one of those arguments is that there's an argument against it that's not completely crazy. Like, if you're not a complete anarchist like we are, you could say, I'm against war usually, but sometimes you need to have war, right? Or you could say, yeah, I don't like taxes, but we have to fund the government somehow. So it's a necessary evil. So like all of these things, there's a little bit of an argument that you have to always fight against, with 2 exceptions, in my view: the drug war and IP. There's just like no good argument for the drug war because it's a totally victimless crime, right? Even then, you could say the argument is that if you have a welfare state, then they're going to get addicted to drugs and they're going to be a bigger strain on society's, safety nets. I guess you could even argue for drug regulation for that reason, but that's assuming that we have a welfare state and that kind of stuff. But like really the drug war and intellectual property are the two clearest and cleanest arguments you can make that are the criticisms you can make of the state and its policies where there's really not a single good argument for them at all. And the reason the way to understand this is to unpack the arguments for intellectual property. Okay, so, and I'll summarize this for a second, and then I'll stop and let you ask questions. The two main arguments for intellectual property is, number one, it's the Lockean argument that if you create something that you put your effort and labor into, that's of value to other people, then you have a property right in it. So there's this sort of implicit assumption that creation is a source of property rights. And the reason people believe that is because they associate the labor needed to be productive in normal life and the labor that always goes into, and the action that always goes into humans doing things and using scarce resources, like acquiring an unowned thing or transforming it into a more useful thing, having a successful crop yield, building a house. They sort of associate the labor that you put into it with your success. So they get this positive connotation for effort and work. And they tend to think that there's a correlation in nature, like in natural law or something, like if you perform work, then you deserve a reward. But of course, that's not true. In fact, in physics, that's not true, right? I mean, what is work defined in physics? Work is moving a force through a distance. If I push against a wall for an hour, I might sweat, but I haven't done any work because I didn't make the wall move, And by the same token, if I come up with an idea for a new business and I sell, the Palm Pilot, or I sell snow cones in January, no one buys it, and I might have put a lot of effort into it and a lot of money into it, but I'm not entitled to a profit because I don't own the efforts of other people. So there's no right to a profit or a reward from your effort. But people think there is because they think that generally, if you do work hard and if you're smart and you satisfy your customers, then you tend to get rewarded because that's the way society's always worked. And they're right about that, but it's not a right. It's just typically the consequence of that. So because of that mistaken notion, and also I think it's because of a mistaken interpretation of Locke. John Locke was trying to argue against the divine right of kings and Filbert. So he was trying to explode this myth. He was trying to argue for limited government and for limitations of state power, which the argument that the monarch had the right to do whatever he wanted was based upon this idea that, God gave the world to Adam, and Adam passed it down through the generations to the different monarchical kings. So they basically are the overlords and owners of us. And so we don't have any rights. It's all by grace of God. And so Locke was fighting that. And to do that, he had to come up with a naturalistic explanation for why we have rights that are not anchored in the king's grace or grant. And it was basically Locke. So Locke, my guess is Locke was probably an atheist, but he had to use the religious language of the time. God gave ownership of the earth to Adam and all of humanity in commons, is what he called it. And when he said in common, what he meant was, that's what it means to be fruitful and multiply, use the animals. What he meant was that all these resources are there for us to use, but they're in commons, meaning they're not owned yet, they're not claimed yet. So you can go out and claim it. So Locke said, okay, so this means if you're a self-owner, because God actually gave everyone ownership of their own body. So if you're your self-owner, that means you own your labor. And if you own your labor, you own things that were unowned in the world that you mix it with, because you're the first one to grab this animal or this plot of land. So Locke used this idea as a way to support individual rights against the state to say that we do have the right to have property rights in our body and things that we acquire. But unfortunately, part of his argument was a little bit mystical, a little bit metaphorical, because he added this unnecessary step, which is that the reason that you own a piece of land that you homestead is because you owned your labor, because you own yourself. And if you own yourself, you own your labor. And then if you mix your labor with it, then the only way you can retain ownership of your labor is to have ownership of the land that you've now mixed it with, because it's been inextricably mixed with it. So the only way to keep ownership of that labor that you extended is that you have to own what it's bound up with now, which was the land. And the problem with that argument is that it assumes that you own your labor, but you don't. But labor is just a word for a type of action, right? There are two types of actions in economics. There's labor and leisure, right? But the way we classify these actions is just by the purpose for which you're doing it. Like, are you engaging in this action as an intermediate action to attain something ultimately in the end, which is really your end, your consumption good? It's like the difference between consumption goods and capital goods, right? Capital goods are valued because they produce consumer goods. Consumer goods are ultimately the things we want that satisfy human needs, right? By the same token, when you engage in action, if you're doing it for something you enjoy for its own sake, that's called leisure. If you're doing it to enjoy something for its own sake later on, that's called labor, right? So there's just two types of actions. So they're both actions, and actions are things that we do with our bodies because we control our bodies, because we have a unity of mind and spirit, and we can use our will to decide what to do in the world. But no one would have said you own your actions, although Stephan Molyneux sort of talks like this sometimes. But I think he's talking about owning what you do. He means you're responsible for what you do. It's a confusing way to
or have right to it.
Correct. But so if Locke if he had not said labor, if he had said you own your actions, everyone would have noticed that that's kind of a weird way of saying that you own. When you say you own your actions, which is the same thing as saying you own your labor, you're double counting. Because if I own my body, what that means is that no one else can use it without my permission. But because I'm the owner of my body, and because no one has the right to use it without my permission, that's the reason I can do what I want with it, because no one else can interfere. If I choose to do A or B or C, I can do what I want. So my ownership of my body gives me the ability to act as I want. But this ability to act is not like a separate right that I have. It would be like saying you own your home and you own your body, and you also have the right to take a bath in your house. It's like, no, I own the bathtub, and I own the water, and I own my body, and I own the land. That all gives me the right to take a bath if I feel like it. But there's no separate or additional right to take a bath. It's an implication.
Implied. Yeah, implied.
It's implied. It's an implication, but it's not. But when you say that I own my body and I own my labor, you're double counting. And when you double count, you make people think of labor as this substance that sort of exudes from your body that has a. So now you separate the very concept of property arose because of the possibility of scarcity and conflict between people and clashing between their bodies and all these things which we want to use as scarce means of action, right? But when you say, oh, well, it's my labor that I own. And by the way, people use this argument all the time, even libertarians. They'll say something like, well, taxation is slavery because you're stealing someone's time. Now, we all probably agree with, we know what they mean by that. What they're trying to do is they're trying to say that it's unjust to have a government law that takes property that I own, like my money, it just takes it from me. That's stealing, right? That's what taxation is. Taxation is stealing an owned resource from me, even though I have not committed an act of aggression against someone. Now, you can characterize, the reason we oppose aggression is because it has effects, it has consequences. If the government could take my house, but I still have it, I wouldn't care. If they could take my money and I still have purchasing power, I wouldn't care. But that's not how the world works. The reason that we oppose rape and murder and aggression and theft is because it actually has consequences. And the consequence is the person who was robbed or assaulted or whatever doesn't have the ability to use that resource as they see fit anymore because someone else has it. That's why we oppose these things, right? So I forgot where I was going with this. I lost track. Maybe it's a good time for a break.
Well, it might help you remind you. Just I wanted to ask: do you think a reason why a lot of people, even libertarians, get the intellectual property issue wrong is? I sometimes think maybe it's a little bit to do with, at least partly, due to a kind of linguistic trick, because we always talk about, oh, like someone stealing someone's idea, but that's not really the proper word. Like if I steal your car, you don't have your car anymore. If I quote unquote steal your idea, you still have your idea. So I haven't really stolen it, I've copied it. And it's almost like, because of the language we use with intellectual property, it almost begs the question. We're calling it property off the bat. And then when we talk about stealing someone's idea, again, it's begging the question because we're saying, oh, well, we're taking it from them. But that's not, although that's the language we use, it's not the reality. The reality is we're copying. Like an analogy would be if I looked at your house and built a house that was identical to it. If I look at your idea, I'm just going to copy it. I haven't deprived you from it. So there's no aggression. Do you know what I mean?
I think that's 100% correct. And I think this shows the importance of being, this annoys people sometimes when they say, oh, you're going lawyer mode because you're being too precise or anal or whatever. But sometimes you need to be very precise and careful about terms because they do have ambiguous meanings or multiple meanings. And equivocation can often set in, even unintentionally sometimes. I think that what happens is in the pre-digital age, okay, you could get away with being a little bit sloppy with these metaphors by saying that you have the right to your to the fruits of your labor, for example. That's another you have the right to the fruits of your labor, because what they mean by that is that if you have your own body and you're not hurting anyone, and you own something you got by contract or some farm that you homesteaded on your own, that you can profit off of that if you're successful because you have the dominion over that and you can sell it. So people start thinking, oh, you have the right to the fruits of your labor. And then what they're doing is they're criticizing, well, why should the government take it from me? I made it, right? So you start thinking, but the mistake doesn't mean that much. But when in the digital age, when a primary part of the value of things is in the shape of it, or in the a book, for example, or the patterning of it, then we sort of lose sight of the nature of property rights and how they have to be bound up with tangible material things that over which there can be conflict, and you start thinking in terms of value. So this is like Hans Hermann Hoppe has this point, which I think is another neglected and very important point. Something we have to emphasize: there is no property right to the value of things. And in fact, that's an Austrian insight, right? So in fact, this is one mistake the Randians make, I think, and they make it following Locke and this. So Locke's idea is that you own your body, so you own your labor. So now you have this non-tangible substance, and the reason you own it is because it has a value, right? So the Randians will say that we have a property right in values. They use the word values like as a plural or as a noun. Whereas in Austrian economics, we say you demonstrate your preference, or you demonstrate your value. You value things, or you value outcomes, but you don't actually own value. Value is not a material substance of a thing. There's no intrinsic value in a thing. But when you so for example, if I own a home and I have a rose garden, which everyone likes to see, even my neighbors, it actually might enhance the value of my neighbor's property, because if they were to sell their home, the buyer might say, oh, I get to look at a beautiful rose garden. But if I tear that rose garden down and I have an ugly house, I actually reduce the value of their property. But that's not a trespass, because they don't have a property right in the value of the property. And again, it's like the customer thing. It's like if people say, oh, you stole my customers from me because you knocked off my iPhone. Well, but you didn't own your customers, did you? By the way, in your example about the use of language. If you get precise and you say, well, you said that I stole your I knocked you off, or I was a pirate, or I stole your idea by selling a similar smartphone to you. And if you point out, as you did, but you still have your phone and you still have your designs and you still have your ability to make them, then they will say, well, what I really mean is you stole the money. I'm like, well, what money? They'll say, well, the money I could have made. You mean the money you could have made if you had a monopoly and you could prevent people from competing? Yeah. I'm like, well, so in other words, I stole the money that's currently owned by possible customers who own the money. You don't own their money, they own it. Are you saying you have a property right in the money, in the money in the pockets of your potential customers? And they don't want to say that, but they'll say, no, but I could have made, so it's if you push them, they will certainly concede. And then they go to question begging. They'll say, yeah, but when you competed with me, you stole my property. It's like, yeah, but the whole debate was about whether you should have a property that, and in fact, the debate's already won because it's already lost on your side, because you and I both already agree that I own my factory, you own your factory. Okay? So nothing I did violated your rights. I stole your customers, but they weren't your customers. By the way, I think it's not Mencken, it's someone. Let me see if I can find the quote. He had this quote. It's about the use of the word the possessive. Like if I say my wife, okay, that we use that word in English all the time. My wife, my son, but doesn't mean I own her, because because there's a possessive used doesn't imply a property relationship. And the same thing is true of like my idea or my invention. That's just a way of giving credit or authorship or admitting or acknowledging who came up with the idea. It doesn't mean that you own it, right? So just if someone acknowledges that, like Thomas Edison, which he didn't, by the way, but let's say Thomas Edison came up with the idea of the incandescent light bulb, it's his idea, but it doesn't mean that it's his property right. We have to be careful not to let language corrupt our thinking. Okay, and by the way, this was the first argument for IP is the Lockean argument that's I call this libertarian creationism, because it's the idea that creation is a source of property rights, but it's simply not, because creation is only what creation really means is transformation. It means, this is where you have to distinguish wealth, okay, wealth from property. If I use my labor and my intellect and my efforts and my property that I own, like resources, input factors, to like, let's say I make a car out of raw materials, like Henry Ford did, right? I have transformed things that I own into a different configuration. I've rearranged them, and I've made them more valuable to me or to customers. So I've created wealth. But just like I don't have a property right in the value of my property, you don't have a property right in wealth. Wealth is just the phenomena of having successful human action to transform something that you already own. But the point is, the ownership of the resulting car is determined totally by property rights and contract law. This is exactly why, by the way, I believe that the mistake Locke made, and the mistake lots of modern Randians and pro-I people make, is very similar to the essential mistake of Marxism, which I think actually, so I think the labor theory of value came from this labor theory of property of Locke. So you had Locke, and then you had Smith, and these other guys, and then of course Marx, which is why Marx thinks that if you have workers on a factory line, the Henry Ford's factory line, if Henry Ford is making a profit, that necessarily means that he's stealing from the workers. What's he stealing? He's stealing the surplus labor value, because he thinks that there's a property right in labor. It's all connected, right? Whereas the the libertarian or the private law approach would be the ownership of the cars that are produced is determined in accordance with property rights. And the workers never did own the input factors. Henry Ford's corporation did. And he had a contract with them to pay them a salary for performing labor or performing some actions. And they got what was agreed to. And if he makes a profit, it's because he took his property and he had it rearranged into a better shape that was more valuable, and he sold it for a profit on the market, right? So anyway, that's the creationist mistake, which I think leads to Marxism and to communism, socialism, and lots of confusions now about IP. But the primary argument for IP really today is the utilitarian argument, and that's the argument that that basically the argument, and most people don't want to put it this way because they want to admit that that's what they're saying, but the argument is a market failure argument. What they're saying is that, oh, the free market's all well and good, capitalism is all well and good, we need property rights. However, the free market is not perfect, so we need the government to come in and identify market failure. And the market failure is with certain types of goods, especially goods, the value of the product is heavily based upon the design of the product instead of like the raw materials that go into it. In those like books, for example, or like an iPhone, in those cases, you could face competition too quickly because it's too easy for a competitor to knock you off, which means to compete with you and to copy you, and therefore you won't be able to make enough profit to recoup your first investment cost in this, and therefore you won't engage in the activity in the first place, and therefore we're going to have an underproduction. They call this an underproduction of creative works. So you would have fewer books and fewer inventions without patent and copyright law. So most of them are not stupid enough to say you would have no inventions and no books without patent and copyright. Although some people do say this, they're that stupid. They literally say that if you don't have patent and copyright, no one would ever write a book and no one would ever invent anything, which is just ridiculous. The best argument you can make is that there's an optimum amount of invention in the world. And in the free market, unfortunately, because of market failure, we're going to have a suboptimal amount because people can't recoup their costs. So if we just fix this problem by giving them a patent to protect them from competition for 17 years, then they have enough of an incentive to sell it for a while at a high price because they don't have any competition and recoup their costs. And so in the end, having this patch on the free market is a way to have more optimal innovation. So this is the primary utilitarian argument today for copyright and for patent. It's that without patent and copyright, we would have an underproduction of creative works and inventive works. And the problem with that argument is there's several problems with it. One is that there is no evidence for this at all, zero. In fact, the evidence goes the other way around. Number two, this is not the purpose of law is to maximize the production of innovative works. The purpose of law is to do justice. And number three, to think the government is competent at doing this is ridiculous and absurd. And number four, it assumes that the cost of this system is worth the value of this extra innovation that they stimulate, which there's no evidence they stimulate innovation anyway. But even if they did, so let's say that the patent system costs globally $7 trillion a year in terms of lawyers' fees and enforcement and insurance and risk aversion, all kinds of things like this. And yet it generates, I don't know, X trillion dollars in new innovations that wouldn't have been invented for another 10 years. Okay, how do we know that the cost of the system is smaller than the value of this new extra innovation? There's no, like, you would think that at least the burden of proof would be on them to acknowledge this cost, to quantify it, and to show that it's positive, which they can't because it's actually not positive, but there's no evidence for this. So the utilitarian case falls, and plus the utilitarian case is morally bankrupt because it rests upon the assumption that it's okay to violate someone's rights if someone else is better off. Well, that's just redistributionism. I mean, by that standard, you could say, I mean, you could justify putting innocent people in prison as long as it dissuades, it deters murder, let's say. Well, as long as people believe this guy's guilty, we need to put him in prison, even if he's innocent, because that would send a signal and stop other murder. I mean, you could do all kinds of things in the name of utilitarian arguments. You could say, everyone who's worth more than $1 million, we can confiscate 90% of their wealth and redistribute it to the rest of the world, because, you know, if you take half of Bill Gates's wealth, he's still a billionaire, but the 500,000 people that you give free houses to, they're so much happier. So let's just do this balancing thing. Oh, but where's the end of this? I mean, where's the end of this egalitarian redistributionism? So utilitarianism, the arguments are just so flawed with so many axes. So those are the only arguments for IP. It's that you own what you create, which is not true, and that we need IP law to have less than suboptimal innovation, which is also not true. So ultimately, patent law and copyright law are violations of property rights, because it ends up taking property from an owner and giving it to someone else without their permission. It would be like if the government passed a law saying there's lots of ugly guys out there who can't get laid. Okay, so we're going to give each one of them a voucher, and he can go up to any girl he wants and have sex with her. Okay, now, and if she resists, then he can use force and basically rape her. It's legalized rape. We would all react in horror to that, because we understand that she owns her body, and if the government gives him a license to rape her, it's taking one of her property rights away from her without her permission. You know, contrast that with a normal situation where a man and woman have a date and the woman consents to having sex with the guy. We don't call that rape, because guess why? She consented. And the reason she had to be the one to consent is because she owns her body. If she consents, it's not rape. If she doesn't consent, it is rape. That's the difference, right? And so when the government grants patents and copyrights, what it is doing is effectively granting what the law would call a negative easement or a negative servitude, which gives the copyright or the patent holder the right to prevent a property owner from using their property as they see fit. So if I have a copyright, I can use that. I can go to court and get a court injunction and prevent a competitor from using their own factory to publish a book. Now, again, if I agreed to this arrangement as a factory owner, I agreed not to publish books that are similar to your books, that's perfectly fine. That's called the restrictive covenant, this is what the basis of homeowners associations are. But again, that's because I consented to it, just like the girl who consents to sex is not being raped. But if the government just gives someone this right when I didn't consent to it, that's a taking of my property. This is ultimately the problem with intellectual property rights, is it violates the fundamental core principles of how we come to own resources, which is not counting our bodies for other things. It's the first user of an unowned resource, that's Lockean homesteading, or someone who gets it by contract from a previous owner. That's it. That's kind of the basis of all Western property rights. And even
sorry to interrupt, but even that second part just comes from the first part. Like even the voluntary, it still comes from the. In fact, you even corrected me a few months ago when I said, although I was obviously still basing it on self-ownership, but I think I said something along the lines of you acquire rightful ownership of property through creation or voluntary trade, and you corrected me, said, well, it's not actually the creation that made you the owner, it was the first use, because even if you didn't make anything new, you had to have had a rightful ownership of those raw materials, and your rightful ownership of those raw materials come from your first, from the first use of it. It's like if we both walk into the woods today and I pick out an apple from the tree, before I picked that apple, you had every right to pick that apple. But now I've picked it, it's mine. And then if I trade it to you, then it's yours through voluntary trade, but it's still dependent. The validity of the voluntary contract between me and you of giving you the apple still depended on my first use claim of it sorry, in the first place. So one other thing I wanted to say as well was because I mean, as you kind of mentioned, there's obviously there's the principal argument how this violates property rights, but then there's also the utilitarian argument that people say that, well, okay, it does violate property rights, but we feel that it does this level of good and that. And often, I mean, I don't agree with utilitarianism anyway, because it can be used to justify all manner of horrors if you think that the whole greater good argument. But the other thing is often these utilitarian claims aren't even true, as you've mentioned yourself. I mean, for every person that says, oh, well, who will ever research like a new drug, for example, without a patent protecting their profits? It's like, well, if they don't have that patent protecting their profits, it's also not prohibiting other people from and if anything, innovation thrives on the competition and the sharing of information, which is all restricted and prohibited by IP laws and stuff. So if anything, although I agree with you that the utilitarian argument on its own isn't valid and has its own problems with regards to justifying all sorts of evils, but also often a lot of the utilitarian claims with intellectual property aren't even true, and often the opposite is true. Often the intellectual property laws are actually stifling innovation more so than they would if people were just free to copy. And also the other thing I wanted to say, because when people talk about the market failure, it's like, well, yeah, but the market is operating with IP laws. So, if, for example, I'm a musician, and I've spoken to musicians about this kind of thing, and they say, well, what will I do then how are musicians going to make money if people would just copy their songs and they've got no protection and stuff? And it's like, well, the thing is, if that became a problem, the market demand for music would create other ways. Maybe we'd have academies to fund musicians. There's all sorts of. But the thing is, we don't go down those routes because at the moment we've got intellectual property instead. So you know what I mean? It's kind of like, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy with regards to all these things that they say, would happen as a result. It's like, well, no, they're only happening because of the intellectual property. And if you took that away, the market would have the freedom to adjust in whatever ways is kind of
it's almost like, I won't say it's a laziness, but it's like a fear of getting rid of the status quo that we're used to. Because so you for example, you have people make an argument, which I think is a bad argument, and sometimes it's dishonest and sometimes it's just confused, but the argument is that, well, I think this, like Richard Epstein, like some of these utilitarian, they'll say that, well, patent let's the copyright system is just an efficient way of doing what you could do by contract on the free market. So what they're saying is that, well, if you don't have copyright, people are going to have all these crazy arrangements with each other, like to do what you're saying, right? But in the end, this is going to end up with royalties and all this. So why don't we just make it simpler for everyone? It's like the ASCAP system in the U.S. I don't know what you have in Europe, but this royalty system where you can use someone's song, but you have to pay them a royalty, part of the ASCAP system. But it's sort of built upon the copyright system. But what they're saying is that, like, the government comes in with this statutory scheme, this regulatory scheme, which just makes it more efficient for people to do what they would do anyway. Now, the flaw in that argument is that they think that you could build something like copyright or patent based upon private contracts, which Rothbard sort of thinks too. He's also confused. But I will tell you something. All these people sort of know, all the patent lawyers, all the copyright lawyers, all the people that are in favor of, like, Disney, Hollywood, all the people dependent upon these IP systems, they all know that if you got rid of copyright, there's no way you could recreate the system we have by private contract. So that's why they don't want to do it. It's not because they think the copyright system is like an efficient way to just do what people would do on the free market. No, they want to short circuit what people would do on the free market by supplanting it, and then people get lazy. They say, well, why should we have to do that? We could just I don't want to give up my right to have royalties. I don't want life to be easy and that kind of thing. And by the way, you probably know this as a, I don't know, amateur musician or whatever, or enthusiast. Most artists don't, to this day, most authors of books don't make any money or much money anyway. Partly because they have to, if they're successful, they have to go to a studio and they get most of it. In fact, when I have debates online, it's always amusing to me when someone debates with me about IP and they say, "What incentive would I have to come up with artistic work or creative work if I'm not going to get paid for it?" I said, "But you just replied to me on Twitter with an argument, and you're not getting paid for that. Like literally, you're doing everything you're doing right now, you're doing for free. So what are you talking about?"
Well, it's like if we want it, we will. That's the whole point of market demand, isn't it? If people want it, then they'll find ways to create it, and if that requires a different kind of, like I say, academies or all sorts of things. Before, because we're getting towards the end of, I know, Econ's time. Before we kind of wrap it up, I just wanted to ask Econ, because like Stephan mentioned about, obviously, intellectual property. Obviously, we've spoken about how it should be or should not be, as the case is. But we've also spoken about like how it exists in different countries and how it's different. I wondered if you could give us a little bit of insight into what it's like in Nigeria. Is IP something that's heavily policed, or is there a lot of piracy? Is it something that's not heavily policed? What's the situation there?
We have the laws against piracy, but nobody really does much to enforce it. So people just do whatever. So if we have patent laws in Nigeria, and honestly, I don't even know if we have, I'd have to ask my lawyer. I don't know if we have patent IP laws in Nigeria. One thing I do know is if you take an idea to, so probably shouldn't be saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway. I had an idea that I took to the government a while ago. This was before I became libertarian, so please forgive me. So I had an idea that I took to the government. So it was an application. I wanted them to build an app for something, and I took it to the government. I'm not going to give details so I don't get hunted down. So I took it to the government, and I was like, "This is the idea." They're like, "This is spectacular. This is beautiful." So I went for meeting after meeting after meeting, and eventually nothing came of it. And a friend of mine who was working on the same project with me, all the way from the UK, sent me a news article showing me how the government had done the exact same thing I proposed to them without telling me, and they were having difficulty running the application. Right. So I can't say for a fact that it was my idea that the government took. I can't say that for a fact, but it's Nigeria is possible. So the point I'm trying to make is this: even if you have patent laws in Nigeria, if you have IP laws in Nigeria, things are so corrupt here that the government might actually be the one to sell the idea to the highest bidder. So it's not really a big thing here. You're better off not patenting any idea if such a thing exists in Nigeria. I would just like to say something in response to everything Mr. Kinsella has said. So I didn't really know much about the intellectual property argument, and again, because it's not something. So I'm Econ Bro for a reason, because we have economic issues in Nigeria, right? So I'm focused on economics. That's the major thing I emphasize on is economics here. However, I do dabble into politics and a couple of other things. So IP isn't really a problem, but I just gave it basic thought. I didn't think too much about it, and as you both have rightly said, the reason why I thought intellectual property is silly is because there's no scarcity, right? If you have an idea, so with other property like land, like a car or anything, goods and services are scarce, right? But ideas are not scarce. As you rightly said, if you steal my idea, I still have the idea. So that was how I came to the conclusion that, or one of the ways I came to the conclusion that IP is nonsense. And then the second thing that helped me come to that conclusion was in thinking of how it was going to be enforced. So by default, I'm anti-state, right? So I thought about it. If we have IP laws, then you're going to need the government to enforce it. And I was like, there's no way in the world I'm supporting the government. I mean, as you've rightly said, in order to enforce property, intellectual property rights, you have to violate another person's right to his or her property. So, and by the way, how do you even know that I didn't think of the idea first, right? So I just thought it was, first of all, when I first heard of intellectual property, it was actually tied to Mr. Kinsella. Someone tweeted about it, and I was like, this was when I was new to libertarianism. I was like, these people are crazy. You know, why shouldn't we have intellectual property rights? You know, why isn't intellectual property a thing? That was what I thought. Then I started to give it some thought, and so that was how I came to where I am now. I haven't thought about it as deeply as you have. Obviously, I haven't. But I guess the summary of what I'm trying to say is thank you. You've given me many more arguments because I'm building my case for a better Nigeria, and this is actually going to come up eventually. And I guess I'm saying thank you for Mr. Kinsella and Matthew for setting this up. This adds to. I'm going to listen to this later again when it's out, and read your book. I already have it. So, or the 50-page essay you wrote, I have that.
You seem to have the right instincts because you're focusing on scarcity and the skepticism of the claims.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that you or me? Hold on. Not me. What I was going to say is, what from your point of view, kind of being exposed to this, what are the questions you have about or what are the things you're still not sure about say patent and copyright, or are you pretty skeptical of the idea?
No, I'm all on board. I agree with everything you said. I can't poke any holes in your argument, but then again, I would have to go back and think about it. Like I usually say to Matthew, I have to go back, listen. English isn't my first language, so I would have to go back and listen carefully and then think it through. But I don't think, just instinctively, I don't think there are any holes in your arguments. Everything you've said resonates, makes a lot of sense to me, and I'm relatively smart, so I guess.
One of the points I made early on, I had this article. I wrote a letter. So there was a journal called iOS Journal by the David Kelly's group when he split off from the Ayn Rand Institute, and he started the Institute for Objectivist Studies, which I think now is the Atlas Society. And he had this journal called the iOS Journal, and he had an article in there by Murray Frank, who was one of Ayn Rand's IP lawyers. And Murray Frank had an article defending intellectual property. So I wrote a gentle letter basically suggesting that there's some problems with that argument, right? And one of the things I pointed out was that most of us libertarians and objectivists, we sort of we're sympathetic to our natural rights arguments, like the idea of natural rights and natural law, right? That's why we think we have a natural right not to be murdered and the right to our body. But on the legal side, what we think of is most of these rights got developed and fleshed out in the private Western law of the Roman law and the common law of England, right? And so trespass, murder, all these things were gradually developed in a quasi-private, decentralized legal system. And in the last 100 years, the secondary role of legislation, which is another way that the government, the state, which controls the legal system, can intervene and make special laws by decree. That's what legislation is, right? And most of us sort of have a sense that this making law by fiat or by decree by a government committee, which is what a legislature is not really compatible with how we should discover and develop and protect law It should be found by scientists and thinkers and philosophers and judges and juries, kind of gradually finding the just solution to a given thing, which is how, again, the Roman and the private Roman law and the private Western common law developed. And so I simply pointed out that that should be the way we libertarians should favor the development of law and legal principles, is a decentralized, voluntary, gradual process by a common law type system. And that legislation is not the way we ought to make law. In fact, we shouldn't think of law as being made at all. And so whenever you have something that is an intrusion on the free market and on the decentralized common law legal system, which is a statute, basically, we should be very skeptical of it. And my point was that copyright comes from something called the Statute of Anne in 1709 in England. And patent comes from the Statute of Monopolies of 1623 in England. Copyright and patent both came about from a statute. And the reason is because they never emerged on the common law. The common law was perfectly able to develop and find solutions to conflict and trespass and prohibit rape and murder and theft and extortion and all these kinds of things. But it never did come up with patent and copyright law, because those things were purely artificial creations of the monarchs and the crown, and then statutes, right? So my point was that if you really believe that the common law and the organic decentralized law is the way to make law, then you have to have a deep skepticism about legal systems that only could emerge and that only did emerge from legislation, which is what patent and copyright are. And when I pointed that out to David Kelly and to Murray Frank, Murray Frank's response was that there's nothing wrong with legislation. We might need the legislature to step in every now and then to correct the mistakes of the common law. So they sort of see the government as the decider who has this legislative power to basically create law, to modify the law that the judges came up with, and to just do whatever they want. And I think that sort of betrays a deep problem with the argument, the natural rights argument for patent and copyright, because they're clearly not natural rights. They're not products of natural law. If they were, they would have emerged on the common law naturally, but they didn't. And by the same token, if you abolish the patent law and the patent statutes and the copyright statutes in most countries, in every country, then there would be nothing to fill the gap. I mean, it just wouldn't exist. Which shows that they're just creatures of statute. So to my mind, that's another nail in the coffin, another problem with statutory schemes. It's just like all these laws we have in Europe and America and the West, anti-discrimination laws and welfare laws and just these regulatory schemes that were not the product of natural law at all. They're just edicts by regulators.
They're just arbitrary at the end of the day. It's like, like the law that we kind of identify as libertarians all comes from the presupposition. So it's like logic based, it's like, well, if we own ourselves, then this, then that. Not only does IP not come from that, but if anything, the opposite to IP law comes from that. Like the arguments against IP law comes from that.
Hold on. Can you give me 30 seconds?
Yeah, I think Econ's got to go, so he might have to say goodbye. But I'll still be here, and I'll finish up with you in a second.
I just need okay, Econ. It was nice having you on. I enjoyed it, and let's stay in touch. All right. You're muted,
Econ. Unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. I said I'll wait for Mr. Kinsella to return because I want to ask him a question. It's
okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Just give me 2 minutes. Yeah, 2 minutes.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, hang on. I'll hang up a bit. Matt and I could chat till you return.
Oh yeah, I wasn't sure if you needed to get off in a hurry, so I didn't want to leave you late for your next appointment. But
I had great difficulty walking away from something. I like to complete things. So even though I have something to do, I'll give it a couple more minutes before I, yeah, because I would hate to not see where this ends.
Yeah, I mean, well, this is why I thought it would be a really interesting conversation, because the thing is the work. I mean, as I say, I've got a lot of respect for you, and I've got a lot of respect for Stephan. Every time, the reason why you two are kind of two of my favorite libertarian thinkers, and I am going to keep calling you that, no matter what you say. But the reason why you two are is because every time I speak to you, both of you, there's the courage to explore ideas. There's the courage to contemplate where you may be wrong on something and listen to challenges. There's the humility to, accept those possibilities. Every time I've spoken to you or Stephan, and you're not the only people, but you're two people that stick out in my mind as people that when I speak to about these ideas, I know that the other person's actually listening and actually considering, and not agreeing or disagreeing for any other reason than that's their honest thought. You know what I mean? And the thing is one of the things about this Together Strong project that I'm really trying to kind of make. And funny enough, although this is your third appearance with me, this particular video is actually going on the Together Strong project. So it's your first appearance on the Together Strong project, even though it's your third conversation with me, because the other two were on the Nations of Sanity channel. But this Together Strong project is about trying to bring libertarians together, because there's areas where we disagree, and those areas we should debate because we can learn something from our disagreements. And then there's areas like this one where we don't necessarily disagree, but it's an important element that needs to be explored. And IP is something that often gets forgotten about. People don't always realize the importance of it. Like with the economics, there's a lot of economic implications with IP and stuff like that. So yeah, I just thought it would be really good apart from it'd be really good to introduce you and Stephan to each other, because you're both very important people in Libertarian. So like I say, my favorite people. And I thought it'd be good for you to sort of know each other. But also the other thing is I thought that you're doing all this great work, and you are doing a lot of great work educating people in Nigeria. And I thought that, IP, Stephan does a lot on law and other elements of libertarianism as well. So it's not just IP, but I just thought IP would be a really good sort of feather to add to your bow, if you like, with regards to your own work. Anyway, Stephan's back now, so I don't know if you wanted to ask him his question.
Oh yeah, it's a bit unrelated to, it's entirely unrelated to the IP discussion, but it's something you mentioned. You said you so I'm not trying to be an evangelist here. I am a Christian. And that's you can't live where I live and not be a Christian, Anyway, so you said something about turning away from the Catholic Church. The thing that led you away was the eternal judgment. How could someone be in hell for all of eternity for a crime he committed? Even if he sinned every single day of his life for 100 years. So was that it, or are there other things? Is that the
no? And by the way, let me make clear something. I am very fond of the Catholic Church. I'm very fond of natural law. I'm not hostile to it. And I don't think that my views are linked. I was just simply trying to explain biographically. I think I have an inquisitive mind, and I was skeptical, and I've just noticed in my own life, like willingness to question something in a phase shift. Like, so going from strong Catholicism to atheism, going from nothing to libertarianism, and then libertarianism to anarchy, and then pro-IP, the other. So like I've just noticed these things. They're not connected at all. You don't need to be an atheist heathen like me to oppose legislation.
Oh, no, I completely.
But on your religious question, I that wasn't what turned me against it. It was simply, until that point in time, I was like 15 years old as a young guy. I was not dogmatic, but I assumed the Catholic Church was like correct on all matters of faith and morals, and that was a unified whole. But when I challenged the first thing, which was this hell idea,
Yeah.
that sort of gave me permission to start challenging other assumptions. That's all. It was just how I think. But I'm not saying they all fall together. I'm more friendly towards Catholicism now than I was in my objectivist firebrand days. Although I'm still an atheist.
Yeah, sure. I too had the same. I don't say this to people, but I went through an atheistic, or should I say an agnostic phase myself a couple of years ago. But I was born Christian. I've lived as a Christian all my life, but I too started to, and I had the exact same question that the question you raised of eternal judgment, and let me just say it's been resolved. I don't think, but perhaps we could have a conversation about this another time, because I have to go shortly. But I don't believe the Bible. I don't believe the Bible preaches eternal damnation as is interpreted by the Catholic Church and pretty much most of Christianity. But again, we could talk about that some other time, another time. It was very great meeting you. Honestly, it's an honor. In my mind, you're one of the greatest thinkers in the libertarian movement. Right, so it's very great for me. It's a privilege to be talking to you. So thank you. I'll get your information from Matthew, maybe send you an email or DM you or something. I already follow you on Twitter, so
sounds good.
Thank you, is what I'm saying.
Thank you too.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Econ. Really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation and be involved with this. Thank you, Stephan. Again, really appreciate you taking the time. I thought this was a really great conversation. Oh yes, Legal Foundations of a Free Society, Stephan's latest book for everyone watching. If you don't already have it, check it out. As I say, there was two reasons for wanting to organise this conversation. One was because, despite the fact that me and Stephan have had a few conversations, unbelievably, we hadn't really had a dedicated IP conversation. So I wanted to add that to the catalogue of kind of content that I'm creating, because I do think IP is more important than people realise, and it also connects to other things like rights, contract, what is property. These things connect. So not only do we improve our understanding of IP and why it's not valid, but we also improve our understanding of property rights in general, self-ownership in general, you know what I mean? So it connects to a lot of things. And the other reason why I wanted to have this conversation, as I said before, was because I was very keen to introduce Stephan Kinsella and Econ Bro to each other, because they're my two personal favorite libertarian thinkers who are both doing excellent work. Econ's doing great work in Nigeria, educating people about libertarian principles. Stephan has been doing great work throughout his life on libertarian principles, not just IP, but law, property rights, self-ownership, so many things. So I just thought, in addition to having this IP conversation, I thought it would be great to introduce you two to each other and get you connected, because I think the more libertarians that are connected to each other and having these discussions, whether it's debates, whether it's discussions, exploring topics, I think we all get closer to the truth and we all help each other in our respective efforts. So thank you both for taking the time.
Thank you, Matthew.